Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
We are very privileged to have Joby Warrick with us. He's the national security reporter covering terrorism, weapons proliferation, education, and he's working with the Washington Post right now. Has done his bachelor's from Temple University in journalism, and he joined the Washington Post national staff in 1996. And he has covered national security, environment, and the Middle East, and writes about terrorism. So he has won Pulitzer twice, and some of his books are Black Line Region, and his new book is called The Red Line, which is unraveling the Syria and Americans' race to destroy the most dangerous arsenal in the world. I think its Red Line is releasing on October 2020, and it's about unraveling Syria and Americans' race to destroy the most dangerous arsenal in the world. So we haven't read that book because it's not out yet, and so we don't know anything about that book. But we would love to have you once you have written, the book is out there and we have read it.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Thank you so much for being here.
There are many new narratives that have been built recently when we talk about ISIS and al-Qaeda as well. So there is one very proven fact that that ISIS was started by one of the Iraq wing of al-Qaeda, if I'm not wrong. So it was started by a criminal, a thief, a robber who was very regular to prisons in Iraq and in Middle East. His name was Zarqawi, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And to just give a brief background for our viewers, Zarqawi was the main founder of the Islamic State, as we call it now, and was one of the leaders of al-Qaeda. So, sir, I want to ask the first question will be how Zarqawi, who was associate of Osama bin Laden, got separated from the al-Qaeda faction and then started his own caliphate, started his own idea of caliphate. So how did that transition happen? Can you just explain the process, that transition from being a Osama ally to absolutely starting his own new organization, which is way more brutal and ruthless in nature?
You've hit on something that really became my obsession and my fascination as I was beginning to gather research for this book, because you're absolutely right. Zarqawi is someone who's very unique in the history of modern terrorism as we know it, including jihadi terrorism. He was a sort of acolyte. He wanted to be like Osama bin Laden, but he was such a different kind of character, including, as you mentioned, having a criminal background. As we know, bin Laden was a learned man. He was an engineer. He was associated with the doctor Zawahiri, who was his number two. Then here's this man Zarqawi, who was from the streets of a very tough neighborhood in Jordan, who didn't understand theology and all its nuances, who was more of just a criminal, brutal man at heart. And what we end up with his movement is this criminality, this brutality, lack of intellectual sophistication becomes the template that becomes his new organization. It's also the reason that bin Laden and his followers ultimately decided they didn't want anything to do with Zarqawi, that he was too dangerous, too disturbing, disruptive, and so they tried to push him away. But he became so successful that al-Qaeda eventually offered him a way back into the tent and made him kind of the first franchise of this international organization.
Interesting how much you focus on him in the book. While other writers, when talk about ISIS, focus a lot on Baghdadi, but you have traced back and focus on Zarqawi more, and you're somewhat made him the protagonist of this. So why do you think ISIS would not have existed if it was for him? And why is it so important, as if you can give a bit about his background?
Okay. Yeah. Why he was important is because you think about the moment in which he became famous, which is essentially the early 2000s, after the invasion of Iraq has taken place by U.S. forces. He is someone who is a man of action in a way that's inspiring to lots of young radicalized youths around the world. Young people in the Middle East and throughout the world who are very upset with what they're seeing with this U.S. military invasion of another country, of a Muslim country, and they're looking for someone to strike back and to do something and to be aggressive. And the bin Laden of this period is in hiding. He's living in Pakistan, as we later found out. He's this old man with a gray beard who reads long, ponderous sermons on the internet. Zarqawi comes along as a figure of the internet age, just as it's beginning to blossom. He's someone who fires a machine gun from the hip. He kills Americans with his own hand. He projects himself as youthful and energetic and virile in a way that appeals to people at a moment where there's a lot of anger and frustration in the Islamic world. So a lot of it is tied up with the character and the swagger and the violence. It was sort of the man of the moment and a organization built around him. And so later on, you see these other important figures in ISIS come up, including Baghdadi. But what really is the superstar for this organization is Zarqawi, and also just the image of this almost mythical Islamist warrior who is, wears black clothes and looks like a ninja and is dangerous. This is the person that a lot of young men and women wanted to be like, and that's why he became so popular.
Yeah. So, as you said, Zarqawi was a new age figure who came into the whole Islamic movement, in the Islamic jihadist movement. And you also have said previously that with Zarqawi rise, we witnessed a modern jihadist movement, right? So what was before that, what was the Islamic jihadist movement like, and how did it change to the Zarqawi's Islamic jihad movement?
Yeah, I think if you look at the period, obviously Osama bin Laden pulled off what was the most famous terrorist attack of all time, really, with this attack on New York and Washington, and becomes an international cause. And then yet very quickly his organization becomes under great pressure. The U.S. goes into Afghanistan. The Taliban is driven out of Kabul, and bin Laden goes into hiding. And so there was this great success, but there's not much of a follow-through. There was never another successful attempt on the U.S. in the years that followed that, and instead the U.S. appears ascendant in a way. It's much more militaristic. It's jingoistic in the person of George W. Bush, and it decides that it's going to try to impose its will on other countries that have been really off the agenda for some time, including Iraq. And so bin Laden had this moment, and then it feels like he lost it. And along comes this new model and this new organization that not just is violent and attractive in the ways that we just described, but it also it's more democratic in the sense that anyone could be part of it. With al-Qaeda, it's almost a secret society. You had to join, you had to be admitted and trained. And with Zarqawi, anybody could join. And later on with ISIS, you didn't even have to go to the Middle East. You didn't have to really know anything about the theology. You just had to declare allegiance and commit an act in the name of this violent group. And then anybody could join in any country, whether or not they're actually with ISIS or not.
Yeah. So I'm telling, so you mentioned a very interesting story about Zarqawi when he was imprisoned in Jordan, I believe. And this was long before the American invasion. And he had been arrested with a bunch of other jihadists and an imam in a plot. And he spoke to a physician who regularly visited Zarqawi and his mates. So what did you observe about, like when you talked to him, what did the physician observe about Zarqawi's leadership? How was it like? You had first-hand experience collected in your book.
Yeah. I felt so lucky when I found this physician, because obviously I wanted to try to get inside a young Zarqawi's brain and try to figure out what made him different, what made him appealing. And I happened to through a friend, connect with this doctor who had been with him in prison. And I was able to get him to describe for me what it was like to encounter this individual for the first time and to see how he interacted with his prison mates. What was interesting is, and just to set this stage a little bit for viewers, Zarqawi was arrested in Jordan after he came back from Afghanistan. He had experience as a young mujahideen, and he tried to recreate that experience in Jordan. But he ends up getting in trouble very quickly. He and all his friends are arrested, and then the Jordanians put them all together in a prison in southern Jordan rather, just to kind of keep them isolated and away from the rest of the prison population. And what we see here is that Zarqawi develops here as a leader, because he is a tough guy. He has this charisma. He has this leadership quality, which emerges really in prison. There's another person in that same jail community who is sort of a spiritual leader. He's someone whose name is Makdizi. He's older and more experienced and wiser, and he should be the leader, but it's really Zarqawi is the one that commands everyone's loyalty. And in the end, all these individuals get set out of prison early because of the King of Jordan dies in 1999, and there's a general amnesty, so he gets released. And by the time he gets out of jail, he is not just a leader, but he has a devoted following of all these radicalized young men who were in jail with him, and that becomes the very start of his movement.
So, sir, for the next question, I would like to point this out. So, when the United States came to Iraq in 2003, one of the most initial approach was to dismantle the whole Iraqi army. It was basically a whole process of de-Baathification. And as we all know that Baath party and most of the Iraqi officers were mostly Sunni in nature, even though the country is Shia populated in majority. So how this process of dismantling Iraqi army and de-Baathification of by the Americans led to the rise of certain terrorist elements, including al-Qaeda and ISIS?
It's a very good question and very perceptive, because you're right. There are several elements which were indispensable for the creation of this group. One was the individual. I think the character, the personality of Zarqawi is very important. But the other is the invasion and what happened afterward. The Iraqi army was defeated very quickly, as we know, but then a couple of decisions were made that ended up being disastrous. The first was, instead of trying to use the security apparatus of Iraq to help rebuild the country, they were essentially all sent home. Everybody who was a Ba'athist was denied having a position of authority. All the army officers, the intelligence officers, the people who really controlled the country and could help rebuild the state, didn't have jobs anymore. So they're frustrated, they're angry, they're looking to lash out, and Zarqawi becomes this foreign figure, interestingly, not an Iraqi, but he's someone who becomes a unifying presence. And so you see these former Iraqi colonels and lieutenants wanting to become part of his organization because he's someone who's doing something, he's striking back. If you could imagine a different outcome where more sensible decisions have been made about how to manage Iraq post-invasion, where they may not have gotten this organization. But I think, as it turned out, every single thing that could have helped Zarqawi develop this movement kind of turned in his favor. And I think the American government bears a lot of responsibility for that.
So the American forces clearly realized that Zarqawi was a threat for them, and eventually track him down and kill. And there was an incredible moment, as you mentioned in the book, June, and what happened next? If you can just paint a scenario of what happened at that moment.
So, the Iraqi army is disbanded. We've talked about all those things in the background, and then Zarqawi decides to do some very brash things. And if you think about what the resistance was against the American occupation at the time, a lot of it was pretty small bore. There would be like a hand grenade or a mortar round or an attempted assassination, kind of small stuff. Zarqawi doesn't do small stuff. He comes in a big way, and he decides to go after people who could help the Americans, people who could give the invasion kind of the patina of legitimacy. And we're talking about Arab embassies. He attacks the Jordanian embassy in the summer of 2003. He goes after the international organizations who are trying to help rebuild the country, like the Red Cross, like the UN. And he attacks these facilities, kills their leaders, drives them out of the country. And so very effectively, and I think very strategically, he isolates the Americans, drives everybody away who could help us, and then draws us into a civil war. Because at the same time, He's attacking Shiite leaders, and he's going after Shiite mosques, deliberately trying to set off a civil war between these two important religious factions. And the Americans, of course, are hated by everyone. And so we kind of end up in the worst possible place as being sort of the target by all sides. And he wanted to create chaos, and he did it brilliantly, because that's exactly what happened in the summer and fall of 2003 and early 2004.
All right. So once Zarqawi took over a lot of damage from the Americans as well, which eventually led to his death. And in return, there was a new uprising within the Islamic State, and we saw a new figure that approached, who was not as brutal as Zarqawi, who was not a criminal, who didn't have a criminal background. In fact, he was more of a Islamic preacher. I'm talking about Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi here, who has been recently killed by the American forces. But just coming back to Zarqawi and the time frame between Zarqawi and al-Baghdadi, how does this who is this governing body which elects such and certain members within the Islamic State and declares them as the caliph, as the khalifa? Who are these?
Yeah.
Who is this? What is this basically, the governing body or the council, I would rather say?
Yeah, it is a kind of an internal shura council, which is made up of senior leaders and elders. It's difficult for us to know exactly from time to time who's in it. But what did happen after Zarqawi's death is that the members of that shura council end up deciding that this organization needed to be more Iraqi in nature, because people had mixed feelings about Zarqawi. Did he try to do too much too soon? They wanted to bring more for Iraqi professional control over the organization. And that is the one interesting thing that happens in the interim between the two leaders, is that Iraqi professionals, people who had been senior members in the armed forces and the intelligence apparatus, end up rising through the ranks. And these are people with military experience who understand how to run logistics. They're not crazy kids from Jordan who've been in prison. They're people who really know how to get things done inside Iraq. And that is why when ISIS does reemerge around 2012, 2013 in a big way, it is with a professional cast of leaders that are much more dangerous in many ways, in the sense of being able to take and hold territory, do the things that Baghdadi later was able to do.
So the movement was kind of very isolated and ineffective for a long period after Zarqawi died and Baghdadi coming. That period was, in the brief period, there was the organization very ineffective, isolated, and scattered. And eventually, its remnants were taken over by this guy who declares the Islamic State, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So where does he come from in the picture? Tell us about him.
Interesting, Baghdadi is that he's as said, different from Zarqawi in personality, but he was a unifying figure for ISIS because of his religious background. It becomes important to ISIS in its leadership, the ones that kind of take over the organization after Zarqawi's death, to understand that to have a broad appeal, we need someone who can be the caliph, someone who has the religious credentials, who has ancestral background that can claim to have lineage to Muhammad himself, someone who could say to the Islamic world, we're going to start a proto-state, and I'm the right personality to do it because I'm a religious instructor, I'm a preacher, I have physical ties or biological ties to Muhammad himself. And so he's the one who could walk into a mosque in 2014 and stand before the world and say, this is our moment. This is the new caliph, and this is the new caliphate. And I think again, you look at the indispensable personalities in the history of this movement. Zarqawi was certainly one. I think Baghdadi is another, because he did have the credentials that people around people who tended to support these views saw him as being a legitimate, someone who could be a leader of Muslims from around the world, and he was that.
Okay, sir. So for the next question, sir, when we learn about the Islamic State taking over territories and their sudden uprise up in 2012, 13, mostly after 2011, when they started occupying important territories of Iraq, especially Mosul, one of the biggest cities in Iraq, which was occupied by the Islamic State. And what really impressed me was the factor of Iraqi army there, that they did not really fight the Islamic State, and they actually paved the way forward for the Islamic State to come and capture territories and go and establish the caliph. How do we see the role of Iraqi army here when Islamic State was occupying territories in Iraq?
Yeah. I think there are two important
because
elements.
1 second. So because by 2003, since the Iraqi army was trying to be rebuilt with the help of United States forces, they had a time frame of 10 to 11 years by regrouping and re-establishing themselves, getting trained by the American personnel themselves on ground. So how did they really lose such a big influence?
Yeah, it's remarkable when you kind of break down how that happened, because you're right. Here's a professional army ends up getting beaten by a very small force of who can't say everyone's military training who's in the ISIS army, but they certainly were not professional soldiers, at least in recent times. And yet they were able, with a force that maybe was 10,000, it's a little bit difficult for us to say now, to eliminate or to drive out as many as 60,000 Iraqis and police force. And how that happened was two things. One is that despite American intentions, the Iraqi army was not very well managed to run, and part of the reason was corruption, sort of and particularly the Shiite leadership of that time, essentially appointing senior military positions to people who were friendly to the leadership and were not necessarily the right people for the job. But as we talk to Iraqis themselves, they describe the army as being really hollowed out by 2011, 2012, not being very professionally run, not being well trained and equipped. And the other issue is that the Sunnis, who were really being disenfranchised and sometimes persecuted, were not very sympathetic to the central government in Baghdad, and actually were favorable towards someone like Baghdadi, who was looking to reclaim rights for Sunnis. And in not just the army, many of the tribal leaders that I spoke to when I was doing my interviewing were very sympathetic to Baghdadi's movement at the time, because they saw them as the military force that would save them from this guy Maliki, who was bad news, who was mistreating them, who was doing bad things. And so you combine those two, a weak central army and a Sunni minority that really felt abused and persecuted and were ready to line up with some other movement. This is a perfect storm for Baghdadi when he tried to march into Iraq in 2014. Sorry to talk about perfect storms after your recent experience.
So, coming back to if you go back to the era when Baghdadi was taking was coming to power, there was a civil war. This was after the Arab Spring. There was a protest movement, and this government was finally brought down. The opposition became polarized, and there were new opportunities for these jihadists who would have marginalized before. So, and there were after this period of time, there were a lot of foreign fighters who were coming to Syria, and they were getting financial help throughout the Arab world. But how exactly did they get into Iraq?
And did they get into Iraq and into Syria as well? So yeah, this is, and actually this gets into a lot of the territory of the new book that I'll have coming out in October, because there is this interesting phenomenon when at the beginning of the uprising in Syria, there's a real sense of a true democratic uprising. Students and shopkeepers and others wanting more rights, wanting to overthrow a dictator in fighting, not very professionally, but just doing what they could to resist. And that movement becomes those fighters are eventually replaced by some of the jihadists who are coming in because they see an enemy of Islam who needs to be defeated. So you have great sympathy in the Muslim world for people who are fighting Assad, and they begin to cross the border from Turkey into Syria first, and so joining that fight, becoming part of what was then al-Nusra Front. This is an al-Qaeda linked organization, and then essentially taking sides with whoever was most professional, who's most successful at fighting, who's got the biggest paychecks for fighters, who's got the best weapons. And the answer to all those questions become ISIS for a lot of these people, because ISIS was well funded, it did have good weapons, it had good leadership, and it became the best fighting force on the ground. And then it puts out the call once Baghdadi makes his big speech in Mosul, declaring the start of the caliphate. Then you see many thousands of people, perhaps 35, 40,000. It's hard to tell with precision, but large numbers of people from across Europe, from across South Asia, from Africa, coming and answering his call to become part of the organization. And they were able to come into Iraq and Syria surprisingly easily. For the first year and a half of the conflict, there were no significant controls at the border, and by paying a bribe or just knowing the right person, you can cross very easily. That eventually stops, but it stopped only very late in 2015, when finally some restrictions are placed on immigration, and that flow is stopped. But by that time, Baghdadi has what is essentially the biggest terrorist army that's ever amassed, 10 times bigger than the number that came to help Zarqawi back in the early 2000s.
So, if I may ask you, since you have written a book about al-Qaeda as well, and you've covered ISIS, so it's a common question that we all get most of the time, but still I want to know your perspective on this. Like, al-Qaeda had the same ambition as ISIS had, like establishing caliphate. But if you look at the success rate of ISIS at this point of time, not with the attacks, but with the number of foreign recruitments and the amount of coverage it has got, like every day when you wake up, you see the newspaper, New York Times, Washington Post had articles about ISIS attacks, ISIS as huge coverage that has got. So what is ISIS able to manage to get this huge amount of coverage over these years? What has ISIS done right?
Yeah, it's, I think, a couple of things, and you've alluded to some of them, but they've done a few things very well. One is that they've become experts at using modern communications, using social media platforms, and that was deliberate. And as we looked at this, what was striking to us is that ISIS saw the need to invest in professional communicators, people who know how to put together a good video. You saw in the Zarqawi time, essentially the videos were shaky, handheld, mobile phone videos, just the stuff that anyone can do. By the time they got into Mosul and were setting up studios, they were bringing in professional videographers. And so these terrible, awful videos that we would see them put up was not just a guy with a cell phone. It was 3 or 4 cameramen who knew what they were doing, and they would take film and then go back to studio and then rework it, produce it, make it slick, add graphics, add background music, and with the idea of appealing to a generation of young people who grew up playing video games, who grew up playing Call of Duty and all these other videos that young men and women too, I suppose, like. And the idea was to kind of recreate that look, that excitement, and put out a message with it that said to young people, this is where you need to be. This is your calling. This is your cause for this generation's, for our time. And that was very, very successful. They also understood that, I think al-Qaeda decided that it would only carry out attacks if it could make a big splash and make a big political point. ISIS decided again that anybody can be part of the organization. So you can, go to your corner store, go to a synagogue and stab a couple people. You can run over someone with a car, and they became very helpful and encouraging in putting out very specific instructions on how to do all of that. So if you're a young man sitting in Mumbai and you have and you want to carry out, you have a grudge against society and you want to become a martyr, well, here's the toolkit you need. Here's where to buy the right trucks that can do a lot of damage at a community festival, and that became remarkably successful and effective. And we watched this whole evolution of a media machine mature from 2012, 2013 until 2015, when it was quite remarkable. And people in my country were spending a lot of time just looking at it and trying to think, how do we counter this? What kind of messages can we possibly put out that will convince a young man this is not a good thing to do? And it was baffling to people over here. We eventually pretty much gave up on it.
I mean, that's right, sir. And it's very surprising and shocking at the same time, because you don't really need so much of sophisticated tools and resources to carry such an attack. And media has probably given it a name of lone wolf attacks, in which one single person can carry out a attack of something like what happened in Sweden, or just ram a truck into the crowd, something as similar as that. And even for that matter, Paris attack was something which was just rounded up in $10,000, but it made a huge global impact. I mean, that is something which is very, very surprising and which makes ISIS very identical. So one question I have is from Dr. Animesh Shukla. He is a professor and a philosopher and a political philosopher. He says that in your book, you describe the process in which ISIS occupies Syria and Iraq, and then there are youngsters who will spend their days in net surfing, and a couple of days later they'll perform a collective execution of people in broad daylight, which is very, very disheartening to see how these young guys are being recruited by the Islamic State. Can you please explain, sir, how this transition gets affected from a bored youngster to a person more than willing to commit acts of barbarism?
Yeah, that's a good question. I see two groups of young people who are susceptible to this, and one is the individuals who do travel to the caliphate, who did in recent times, and they would be isolated from the other fighters, and then sort of trained and indoctrinated, made to feel that this was their, God's intention was for them to carry out a suicide mission, essentially, and often not given a weapon, not given a target till the very last minute. And in some cases, we saw this. There were the detonator buttons were sewn onto the clothes or sort of attached to the fingers in some way, so they couldn't change their mind at the last minute. So that's one route. Young people who come into the system and are deliberately groomed as suicide bombers. What we see more recently is ISIS preying on young men who are just disenfranchised for whatever reason. And in our country, in the past, you've seen people, commit acts for right-wing extremism. They'll go out and a terrible case in our country just a few years ago, went to a small church with African Americans and killed, I think, 9 people. And it's that same kind of extreme, I guess, just a pathology, and also just a desire to lash out at the world. And you combine that with a cause, some reason to act in a violent way that's bigger than you and bigger than your local situation, but it somehow has meaning. And it connects with those kinds of young men, almost always young men in their 20s. And it has another set of recruits who are willing to do all kinds of things just to be part of this movement. And that's what we've seen in some of these lone wolf attacks around the world, including the one in Sweden that you mentioned.
Yeah, so it's a more of a broader question that I want to ask you about explaining terrorism as such. So a lot of studies pre 9/11, if you have seen, a lot of studies have shown that we have taken a very macro sociological approach, where we say that a lot of these terrorists come from or have conflicted trends in the social, like wherever they stay, the social system. In general, terrorism has been associated with so-called root causes that have promoted other kinds of political violence as well. Then post 9/11, we have seen this another thing of psychological, that a lot of psychologists have believed that a lot of this people who deal with terrorism have involved disruptive or psychopathological personalities. But right now, when we see there's a new model that's approaching, that's a psychosocial model, which we are seeing with this, that terrorism must not be just a syndrome of, it's not a syndrome, but as a method of social and political influence. And most importantly, we have seen that attributes that terrorists are shaped by the process of social interaction. So if you can tell us, like, how these young kids sitting at another computer end can get attracted to join an Islamic state, which is hundreds of kilometers away.
Yeah. Well, I think we've touched on some of the reasons that ISIS can appeal to a young man like that. I think what's interesting to me is that our ability to de-radicalize or to contact that young person before he does something, before he acts, before he moves, before he tries to go join something, go to Syria or whatever, is so limited. And it's partly because we as societies are not used to grappling with individuals on this level. In my country, the trigger for getting involved in a young man's life is when he actually commits a crime. Then the law enforcement agencies are prepared. They can deal with them. They can arrest him, whatever, prosecute. But we are much more limited in being able to identify a young man who is on the road to getting in trouble, to looking for the warning signs, to activating community leaders, the local mosque imam, or a neighbor, a social group that can help spot people who are getting into trouble, and then try to engage, government in some way to try to make a difference. So that's a big failure in our country, and we keep talking about how do we don't have the tools at this point to try to find those individuals and to try to redirect them. And the other is messaging, and I feel that there are efforts that are being made to put contradictory messages out there in the same space this young person will see. And one example, the American government has been working with some of our Arab allies in trying to create content that if you are a young man on Facebook and you're looking up Baghdadi, or if you're looking up ISIS, a message will pop up in your video feed or in your news feed that will show a different kind of image. It'll have someone who was a veteran of ISIS, but decided that ISIS was not good, was not Islamic, that they were heretics, that they mistreated people, that they were terrible to women, to captives, and to put that message up instead and try to see if they can put alternative ideas in front of the person that's doing this searching. And it's hard to measure success on something like that, because it's hard to measure how do you count people who are going to do something but didn't. But anecdotally, we hear that these are very effective programs that do try to get into the thinking of young people before they radicalize, before they become vulnerable to these messages that cause them to do bad things.
Two quick questions. So one of the things that we have observed with these young kids after they have went there, and a lot of interviews we have seen them, that they have claimed that they have felt like some other being, like they have never experienced that like that moment that they have shared with those fellow jihadists, that they have felt that they can express themselves truly out there, which might not have in their own countries, whether it's the United States, whether it's the France. That feeling which they have shared is also allowing more people to join there. It's because they're painting a picture, a mere picture which might not be there in a non-Muslim dominated country. That's one of the things that I wanted to ask you. The other thing which I wanted to ask you is the legitimization and justification for every activity they do. Like these people, these young kids might have this notion of violence is, in whatever forms, is bad. But when they travel out there, whether it's a persecution, whether it's execution of a journalist, or whether it's anybody, like an innocent civilian, they justify and all the legitimized activities. How much of this division is being created by this legitimization and justification of us versus the narrative with this propaganda that they run?
So I think that's, and to answer the second question first, that is part of what ISIS has become very good at, going back to Zarqawi's time, which is that almost anything can be justified with them if you have an imam who will declare a fatwa, or will find some obscure passage in one of the hadiths that'll say that it's okay to, for example, burn a pilot, as ISIS did with the Jordanian pilot in 2015. And the idea is that if you look back toward al-Qaeda's time, there were these big theological discussions. Is it okay to kill innocent Muslims that are sort of collateral damage in a terrorist attack? They would discuss these things. They would try to seek answers from learned individuals. With Zarqawi, it's the theology is not important as long as you can justify or rationalize it in some way. And their own statements saying that it's okay to do something is good enough for these young men who don't really have the proper training or education, who haven't had a sophisticated upbringing to know how to challenge or to contradict the information they're getting from ISIS. The thing that you mentioned about the sense of belonging, it's almost as if you're in a military organization. A lot of veterans that come out of conflict tell us about this camaraderie they feel, and how it's the greatest experience of their life is to be with this band of brothers. They do things together. That is why I think that you see this interesting phenomenon with ISIS, where many of people who join the organization are people from troubled backgrounds, who were in jail as kids, who were juvenile delinquents, who committed petty crimes, who have been essentially told by society that you don't belong, that you're not, perhaps also because you're an immigrant, because your family's from another part of the world and we don't accept you anyway, but you're also a troublemaker, so you're an outcast. And ISIS offered for these young men a sense of belonging, something to belong to that didn't reject them because of their crazy behavior in the past. Zarqawi was a criminal. He was the leader of the organization. So it's okay for you if you've done terrible things in your life, because we need you and you're part of our gang. I think it was a very powerful message for some of its followers.
That's very right. That's very rightfully said, because not just in face of Islamic State and just Al-Qaeda, there are many other factions, especially like even in Philippines, even in African Al-Shabaab, and even in Islamic Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. Also, we have seen that how they use Islamic verses and books and their texts to jumble up the words and misinterpret and then announce that into masses. So now I will just change the atmosphere a bit and bring you back to the United States, where we will discuss about the American policy. So it has often been debated that American policy, American policy historically has been not very well appreciated when it declares on making ground presence. That can be learned from their experience in Afghanistan, which is still going on, and that can be learned with their experience in Iraq as well. So the alternative narrative has been that America should marshal Arab forces. They should ally with the regional parties such as the Kurd fighters and Peshmerga fighters and forces such as different forces. So what are the probable flaws of the American policy? Because I also see how they were very hesitant to participate in the Syrian civil war, and their direct participation now during the time of Islamic State is not really rewarding. So how do we evaluate the US policy, and what are the probable flaws in the whole scenario?
I think one thing we can say for sure is it has been a humbling experience, for at least for thoughtful leaders in this country. There's one, he's a former Obama administration official, and I interviewed him for my latest book, and he described it that it's like every approach that we've tried has backfired in some way. We were very aggressive in Iraq, went in and invaded a country and occupied it. You see how that turned out. When we decided not to get involved at all, as in Syria, it didn't turn out very well either. It's when we have done the air support like we did in Libya for the uprising there, that's had a terrible end result. At least right now, there's this endless civil war. It just seems like a hopeless situation. It reminds us that it is so difficult to get these things right. And it's also very easy to mislearn the lessons of the last conflict, because we in this country are constantly trying to do the same thing that worked in another case, and it turns out to be the wrong solution for the specific situation that you're involved in. I think humility is important for my country, because we do have this sense that everybody wants to be like us, that everybody is like us in some way, and that if they only saw the light, they would want to have a Jefferson-style democracy and do things like we do. What we've learned the hard way over and over again is that people want to manage their own lives in their own country. And when we do help, and it's important to be helpful, important to be part of a, trying to make the world a better place and trying to correct injustice when we can, but to do it in a humble way, working with local people to make their own countries better, because those are the solutions that stick. The ones that are imposed from the outside almost always eventually fail.
Okay, so when we talk about United States involvement in a military manner, we also come across the presence of NATO and other allied forces. And we have seen NATO's presence in Afghanistan very frequently, and it has been there since a very long time, right, in the ISAF mission. And when we come back to Iraq and Syria while combating the Islamic State, what role does the United Nations or international community, with special emphasis on the NATO forces, play here?
In Syria specifically?
Yeah, in Syria or Iraq, in the region, I would say.
Yeah, we've discovered again the limits to what is possible sometimes, because the problem of trying to do things internationally, as we've seen over and over again in Syria, is that not everybody agrees with our solutions. And it takes, in the UN Security Council, only one opponent to stop any action of significance. And so even trying to, negotiate a peace deal or a ceasefire or you know, get access for humanitarian supplies. Everything is complicated, and in particularly in Syria, where you have major powers on very, very different sides of the fight. And you know what we can accomplish in Syria. I mean, people, it's almost a cliche in this country because I hear it so many times. It is the problem from hell. It has become one of the biggest international disasters of our time, and we've seen that this country, my country, hasn't been able to do anything effectively to change the outcome. And even looking back historically, and I've spent now 2 years looking at sort of the root causes and the things that my country considered doing to try to help and considered intervention and try to get involved in the chemical weapons problem. And everything turned out to be much more difficult and much more complicated and have unintended consequences. And I have to say, just again, it is a completely humbling experience from an international point of view, how ineffective we ultimately are in trying to change other people's problems. It's often just not possible.
So when we talk about United States involvement, we also learn about the facts that there are regional allies who are also willing to participate in the whole scenario. For example, there is a role what the Kurdish fighters are actually playing. The Kurds are playing in the northeast state, and then they have a very worrying situation overhead, which is the Turkish influence on the Kurds fighter, which is actually combating them on a daily basis, who are recognized as terrorists by the Turkish administration. At the same time, we have Russia, which is backing the Assad regime, and even we know how they have their whole campaign of carpet bombing. I would rather use the term in many villages and in the rural areas of Syria. So, what are these potential roles that the Kurdish fighters play and the Russia and Syria alliance, I would say, play in the whole game?
This is you've hit on an issue that when I talk to people, as I have for this latest book, it is a frightening problem because it's hard right now to see a good way out of the predicament that we're in right now, because the Kurdish fighters, as you said, have been extremely important to our counter ISIS campaign.
Exactly.
We've worked very closely with them, but they're also viewed as terrorists by one of our NATO allies, who was determined not to allow a significant autonomous Kurdish presence to develop at the border. So how do you negotiate a way out of that? And it's right now, I haven't seen any good ideas that are being put forward. The only thing that's the sort of default plan is, well, let's keep an American presence, a small one in the country, and we could at least try to keep peace for now. But it's not a long-term solution. Eventually, Syria is going to come back together, or it's going to split apart in different autonomous regions, and either outcome is not satisfying to one or more parties in the region. So this is something that I think is going to continue to haunt us and perhaps be a source of future conflict and perhaps terrorism, because when you have open conflicts and we have ungoverned spaces, it's an invitation for the worst elements of society to move in and try to do something.
Talking about the United States, I want to ask you a question about one of the most darkest, secret, on an open secret that the United States might be afraid of. It's a Guantanamo Bay prison, which from the time 17 years ago, the first prisoners set up camp and camping to close the Pentagon-operated prison, but Donald Trump camped it back up. Which was attacks on the United States on this attacks, or still was the reasons why a lot of young boys from the United States or from the Western world join ISIS. Yeah, I was asking the Guantanamo Bay and how it's still it's a dark part of the history of the United States, and how a lot of young boys get affected by the torture stories that come about, inspires more people to join ISIS or the Islamic State against the state.
It is so interesting for us to follow this in this country, because everything about Guantanamo Bay is so different from the American experience as we like to think of it. Having a sort of extra legal facility holding people indefinitely without formal charge with no real possibility of seeing justice anytime soon. I mean, there's discussion of military tribunals and eventually we'll try to deal with the population, but nobody wants those prisoners in the United States. There's big political fights about that. So what do we do with this strange thing that we've created, and now is getting close to 20 years old? The number of individuals there, it's not very big anymore, but it's a hugely expensive operation. It makes absolutely no sense, and as you correctly said, it is just terrible for the U.S. public image and great advertising for all the folks that want to join these terrorist groups. It's Guantanamo Bay. It's these orange, young men in orange jumpsuits, Abu Ghraib prison. These are the kind of the damaging images that have kind of countered, undermined all the positive things that we've tried to do in our country, our appeals to democracy and justice and rule of law. How can you make those, how can you pretend to be a country like that when you have a place like Guantanamo? And so those are the philosophical discussions that we're having here within ourselves. And remarkably, our two political parties can't get together on a solution. I think everybody agrees that it's terrible for our image. It's a terrible problem financially, economically, and every other way. And yet we can't seem to get ourselves out of it.
Okay. So I'll ask you a more philosophical question to begin with, a more futuristic question. So after the death of Baghdadi, how do you look, what's the future of ISIS? That's the one thing which I wanted to ask. The other thing I wanted to ask is, during this period, the ISIS brigades to gather. So I was talking about the Al-Hol camp, where thousands of, tens of thousands of women and children had previously lived under Islamic State, is living through difficult conditions. And it is believed that the women who are living in those camps are spreading the ISIS ideology among the children who are growing up. Even so, there's no physical fight, but it's an ideological fight that's going on inside the camp where the ideology spread fast. So, where do you look? What's the future of ISIS in those two contexts?
Yeah, good questions. And the future of ISIS, it's something myself and a colleague we've been spending a lot of time the last few weeks asking that question. And we see two trends, and there one is encouraging, and another that you've hinted at is not. The encouraging one is that among European Muslim populations in particular, there seems to be a kind of a falling out with ISIS. That ISIS has been somewhat degraded. It's lost a lot of its appeal because it's been defeated. The Caliphate's defeat was a powerful counter message in a way, because when we interview young people who felt a few years ago that they were really interested in ISIS, they tend in our conversations to be rejecting their ideology, to say that they made mistakes, that we don't feel this was a good formula. So we hear that from law enforcement as well, that people that are coming out of prisons are not they're not joining again, they're not committing new offenses. So all these problems we were worried about with these former fighters returning to their homes and then being still radical, we're not seeing much evidence of that. So that's the hopeful thing, that maybe for some people at least, there's an ability to get beyond ISIS and try to return to some more of a normal condition. What we do see as worrying is that in some of these places, particularly in al-Hol, but in other prisons, there are very large populations that are quite radical. And we know this because we've been in some of these camps. We talked to some of these individuals, and some of them are essentially mini caliphates run by women, where there's Sharia laws enforced. People are severely punished and sometimes killed when they do things they're seen as against the rules. Young people are absolutely being indoctrinated and taught that the ISIS way is the correct way. So there's a future problem that we can see on the horizon just because of places like this. And we also see that the appeal to this ideology is always present in the sense that if conflicts continue, as the Syrian civil war continues, as as ethnic divisions continue to kind of raise their head in Iraq, the potential is there for ISIS or a group like ISIS to come back, because it just needs to have support of local populations and a grievance that it can try to unite behind. All those elements are at least latent on the ground, and you can easily see opportunities for these groups or groups like them to come back in the next few years.
That was very insightful, sir, especially when you described that there will be many follow-on conflicts that will result even when the ISIS episode ends. And when we talk about regional stability, we also should notice that we need a sort of diplomatic miracle. I would rather put it to ensure a lot of that all the actors are satisfied and well fed. So my from the last question from my side will be very different. Okay, so I recently discovered that HBO had a series with Bradley Cooper's production team coming up for Black Flags, if I'm not wrong. And I haven't heard, because this thing I read was from 2016, and after that we haven't seen any update as such on that. So can you just quickly tell us what's going on under the hood, please?
So one thing I've learned, being someone who is not at all from the Hollywood universe, I'm a print reporter and I've always been, but these projects work at glacial speed, and we do have a project that's still viable. Some of the characters or individuals involved have changed, but
Okay.
I am still extremely hopeful, and I think I have pretty good reason to think that there will be a TV serial version of Black Flags. And I also my earlier book, Triple Agent, is also a script is being developed. So I'm excited just because it means that it introduces the book to a new audience and allows people to hear a story that I think is important. I mean, for me, it was rewarding to write, just because I really enjoyed the reporting. I learned so much. But for so many people, to be honest, don't read books these days. It would be great if we could see either of these books in a platform that's accessible to people around the world. So I'm crossing all my fingers and hoping that it happens.
All the best.
Okay. So I'll just end up by asking just one last question, so that
Sure.
you can quickly answer us. So it's about a very strong criticism that we get from research scholars who study terrorism studies, whether it's Andy Silk, whether it's Alex Kim. So most of them say that, most of them scholars have pointed out before that one of the major challenges in studying or reporting terrorism is the lack of first-hand stories or the primary sources that we get, whether it's interviewing terrorists directly or former terrorists, or whether it's getting in touch with the bureaucratic processes, the intelligence department, the police department. And most of us, when we write books or when we write an article, we come to rely whether it's ISIS, a marked news agency, or whether it's normal media reports that we get around us. So how, as a journalist, will you break that barrier of going the extra mile to report? And how can we ensure? Like, one of the report that was in 1996 or 1997, there was a report that 20% of people, out of this entire ratio, only 20% new information comes up only when a person writes about it. The other things that we all know about us, it's all we know. But 20% new information comes out when a person writes and interviews firsthand. So how, as a journalist, can we go and report there?
Yeah, that's a great way to end this discussion, because it's one of my challenges as someone sitting in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, so far away from some of the conflict zones. How do I begin to get to really understand these problems? And my solution has been, I feel like I'm in a privileged position because I have, because of my job, access to power, decision makers in Washington, including on the intel level, people that we deal with frequently and we get to know, and they trust us in the sense that they're able to talk to us fairly candidly. So you do get that part of the story. But the other part of the story, the important part, is to go to the places where the things are happening. And for Black Flags, I was extremely lucky in that I was able to spend time talking to people on the periphery of ISIS. We didn't risk our heads literally by interviewing Baghdadi, not that he would talk to us, but to try to talk to people who are in that community. And sometimes it was very stressful, just making arrangements to visit someone who you didn't know how it's going to end up. Is he going to try to kill you? We had to take all kinds of precautions to make sure that we were safe. But I felt it was extremely important to get those points of view and to work with, I don't speak Arabic, unfortunately, but with a great journalist colleague who's a fluent, mother tongue Arab speaker who could help me understand the cultural references and to make sure I understand the full context of these interviews. Now I have the fortune of working with a great Washington Post journalist who is she's Moroccan and Turkish. She's actually a German citizen, but her mother is Turkish and her father is Moroccan, if I didn't get that mixed up. And she's actually Sunni on one side and Shia on the other. So they call them sushi. And so her ability to communicate and fully understand the positions of all a whole range of people in this arena is invaluable. And so we spend a lot of time together, and I sometimes will just depend on her to help me get access, or together we can get access to people who can really tell us what's going on. If you can't get that kind of access, you can't begin to tell the story properly. I totally agree with that.
Exactly.
These are great questions. I was honored to spend time with you and really enjoyed the conversation.
Honor is all ours, sir.
Let you go. There's one small task for you.
Okay.
The task is basically giving out a recommendation reading list for all our viewers out there.
Okay.
Top five books which you want our viewers to read.
Well, that's always a big challenge because I have so many good friends who've written great books, and I don't want to leave them out and make them upset. But I still think that one of the most interesting and also engaging books on the origins of the modern terrorist movement was Lawrence Wright's book, The Looming Tower, that came out in 2006, I think. But it's a terrific read. He has a very approachable style. He writes kind of character-driven nonfiction, but he's absolutely fidelity to the facts, and he tells a great story about the early days of the al-Qaeda movement. So that's one of my favorites. And I will also just mention my colleague I spoke about a moment ago, my sushi friend, and she wrote a book that just came out in 2017. I think it's called I Was Told to Come Alone, and it's her personal experiences interviewing officials within the Islamist jihadist movement over the last 18 years. People who were involved in 9/11, people who were involved in the start of ISIS. Because of her language skills and her cultural ability to relate to some of these people, she's been able to access a remarkable number of people who are at the edge of this movement. And it's a joke that we talk about quite a lot, is that she's been proposed to by 4 or 5 different ones that wanted to marry her. So she makes quite an impression when she does her interviews. But her access is really remarkable, and she's written a great book on the subject. So I'll leave it at those two.
Yeah.
And my next one, of course.
Okay. Sure. So actually, we were ending it in that way only. So thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to host you. And it's not every day we get to talk to a person who has won Pulitzer twice, and especially enlightening all us about various facets that are going into the world of the Islamic State. Thank you so much for being here, and we hope to see you when you release your book, The Red Line, and when you read it.
Absolutely.
We definitely want to talk to you about that in our future videos.
Thank you for great questions and for your thoughtful interview. I really enjoyed meeting both of you. Good luck with the show.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
All right. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.